This is the second video in a series on the origins of liberalism. The first looked at how changes in theories of knowledge in the Renaissance and Enlightenment paved the way for individualism. If you haven't already, I'd strongly encourage you to watch that video first and then come back to this one. In this video, we are going to look at how changing views of happiness within the medieval era to the Enlightenment and beyond underpin the emphasis upon pleasure within the liberal tradition. To begin with, it will be useful to clarify the philosophical concept of the supreme good, what in Latin is often called the summum bonum. All our actions are directed towards the accomplishment of some end. For example, I eat cereal to satisfy my hunger. These aims can be categorized as to whether they have instrumental or intrinsic value. The goal of an action is instrumental value if it is a means to attaining a thing desired for its own worth, something with intrinsic value. So, if I work 9 to 5 so that I can make money to buy food which, when I eat it, sates my hunger, then the goal of making money is instrumental for my eating food, which is itself instrumental for removing my hunger, which is the desired end in itself of this chain of actions and motivations. The supreme good is that thing which is of absolute and ultimate value, and as such the attainment of it is that which all other actions and goals should be instrumental. They should be directed towards the attainment of this supreme good. Within the history of philosophy, philosophers have attempted to identify what it is which is of the highest value, upon which they then built systems of ethics aimed at getting the supreme good. Thus, in its broadest sense, the question of philosophy, at least prior to the 20th century, has been broadly construed as such. What is the supreme good, and how does one attain it? The medieval Christian answer to these questions was informed by a synthesis of Aristotelian and Augustinian ideas. Aristotle had argued that all substances have a telos, a purpose which, when performed, constitutes their perfection. This is what he called the final cause of a thing, and its completion constitutes the reason for the object's existence. It is what it tends towards. Thus, an object's supreme good is the fulfillment of its ultimate function. For Aristotle, humans also have a special function, the completion of which perfects human nature. He identified that it is the possession of virtue, the disposition towards moderation in thought, feeling, and action, which is the purpose of human nature, because by possessing virtue, one is made unqualifiedly good, and the unqualifiedly good is the only end with intrinsic value. Consequently, the supreme good for Aristotle, at least for humans, is an objective state in which a person has become morally virtuous. Augustine of Hippo, influenced by biblical and Stoic teachings, made important amendments to the Aristotelian theory of the ultimate good. In his view, echoed by Aquinas and other medieval thinkers, human nature is driven by desire. We love what we enjoy, and as such we pursue the acquisition of what we love. All people are fundamentally motivated by unconditional love for what they perceive to be the supreme good. All other desires are instrumental to the attainment of that ultimate thing. However, most people, due to the corruption of their faculties by original sin, are mistaken in what they interpret as the ultimate good. In reality, it is communion with God which is the supreme good of human nature. This is because when united with the divine, following the last judgment, the soul and resurrected body will be in a state of blessed perfection. This will be subjectively experienced as the highest form of pleasure. infinite in quality and everlasting in duration, both spiritual and sensual. The state of happiness, thus, has an objective basis in the perfection of human nature, which is subjectively experienced as ravishing joy. Think of St. Teresa's ecstasy. Communion with God is attained, Augustine argued, through the virtue of love for God, as the affection of love draws its subject and object together. Whereas for Aristotle virtue was an end in itself, for Augustine it has been instrumentalized as a means for attaining the blessedness, which is perfection, which, as an aside, produces intense intellectual and corporeal pleasure. In the 17th century, there was a subtle, yet significant, reconception of the supreme good as pleasure or happiness. This can be seen in the preaching of Puritans, such as Bishop of Bangor in Wales, Lewis Bailey. His work, The Practice of Piety, was immensely popular, reaching its 74th edition in 1821, having been translated into at least 9 languages. It also was involved in the conversion of John Bunyan, the writer of Pilgrim's Progress. The first 4 chapters attempt to persuade the reader to commit to the Puritan way of life. Bailey argues this should be done because those who follow Puritanism will attain infinite and everlasting happiness in communion with God, while those who don't can expect to experience an infinite and everlasting misery and torment in hell. A similar argument lies at the heart of Roman Catholic Blaise Pascal's wager that the person undecided on religious belief should become Christian, because if Christianity is true and they believe it, then it will result in their infinite happiness. If they don't believe and it is true, they will receive excruciating pain in hell forever. And if it isn't true and one believes, only a little pleasure is lost, while a little pleasure is gained from unbelief, which is correct. Crucially, what constitutes the supreme good, then, has shifted for Bailey and Pascal. It was no longer the state of perfection produced by communion with God. Rather, it was the experience of unlimited joy produced by communion with God, which is of ultimate value. The pursuit of this spiritual pleasure constituted the rationale by which one should seek communion with God. This change made sense, given that apologists for greater religiosity, like Bailey and Pascal, followed Augustine in believing that humans are motivated by what they enjoy and seek out the best pleasures. Thus, to persuade audiences to follow their brand of religion, preachers presented their way of life as the means to infinite and everlasting delight, thus reifying it as the supreme good. At the end of the 17th century, John Locke, the father of classical liberalism, shared the view that all human actions are directed towards the pursuit of happiness. It is uneasiness, the state of pain and absence of pleasure, which motivates us to avoid our pain and attain pleasure. In other words, it moves us to act, to change the world, so that we can receive happiness. Now, true happiness consists, for Locke, in the fulfillment of those desires consistent with God's natural law. God's law is instantiated within the world, and we can determine it through pain and pleasure. We can understand it and experience it. This is his empiricism bringing through, his idea that knowledge comes through experience. As such, when we do bad things, such as get drunk, it leads to pain, such as having a hangover afterwards. Whereas when we obey the law of God, revealed in the Bible, we receive pleasure. It is the potential reward of delight and punishment of pain, particularly in the afterlife, which Locke believes is needed to motivate humans to obey God's law and to help them understand it and know it. Yet he concedes, if there was no judgment day, and as such no reward of happiness or punishment of misery in the afterlife, then it is most rational to satiate all of our desires and flee all that pains us in the here and now. Immanuel Kant also believed that the highest good is happiness. He put forward a deontological system of morality, which is an ethical theory that suggests the rightness or wrongness of an action is based upon whether it abides by or transgresses a series of moral laws. Kant argued that moral virtue lies in dutiful performance of those actions which adhere to the categorical imperative, the absolute commandment that should be followed as an end in itself. It is wrong to murder, for example, because it is wrong to murder, regardless of who is being murdered and for what purpose. Thus, it may appear that Kant's ethics resist the Lockean designation of the supreme good as pleasure, for the apparent ultimate end of action for Kant is obedience to the moral law. However, Kant observed that happiness, the fulfillment of an individual's desires, is the goal of all moral actions, and as such this presupposes that it is possible to attain this state of happiness through being moral. However, we observe that many people who are moral do not attain happiness in this life, while the wicked often prosper and flourish. If the summum bonum is to be possible, then we must postulate that there is an afterlife, in which God rewards the soul with that degree of happiness or misery which is proportionate to their moral virtue. This does not undermine, in Kant's view, the idea that we should pursue the moral law for its own sake, for to pursue virtue to attain a later happiness would be to instrumentalize ethical principles in the manner of consequentialism, which judges the rightness of an action by its supposed results. Nevertheless, he believed that the highest good was happiness, and it may be a tension or perhaps even an inconsistency in his philosophy that the moral law is an end in itself, while pleasure proportioned to virtue is the summum bonum. We might say charitably that Kant is trying to return to an Augustinian or maybe even Aristotelian conception where happiness is a product of an objective state, in this case, moral virtue. By contrast, the English liberal philosopher Jeremy Bentham explicitly embraced the notion that happiness is the greatest good. Bentham stated it as follows: "Nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. They govern us in all we do, in all we say, in all we think. What is good, then, is that which creates the greatest amount of pleasure, physical and spiritual, and produces the minimum amount of corporeal and intellectual pain. The moral worth of an action can be evaluated quantitatively. Bentham proposed a philosophic or hedonic calculus by which one could determine the pleasure and pain produced by an action, and as such its moral rightness or wrongness. Variables included the intensity of the pleasure, duration of the pleasure, likelihood the action would produce pleasure, how soon the pleasure could be experienced, the probability that the action would be followed by further actions producing pleasure, or the likelihood that the action would be followed by experiences of pain, and the extent to which the action affects the pleasure and pain of others. In short, one should always act to maximize the aggregate happiness among all sentient beings, the so-called greatest happiness principle. Bentham's prodigy John Stuart Mill, one of the most influential thinkers in the liberal tradition, shared and adapted much of Bentham's utilitarian and hedonistic approach. Like his tutor, Mill argued that actions are right if they promote happiness, and wrong if they produce the reverse of happiness. Happiness here meaning pleasure and the absence of pain. Morally good actions improve the total happiness in the world, while evil actions increase the total pain in the world. Note that for Bentham and Mill, this does not mean that the individual's happiness is most important. Rather, if an action makes you unhappy, or maybe somebody else unhappy, but increases the sum total of pleasure in the world, then you are morally obliged to do it. Thus, this is a kind of consequentialism. The moral worth of an action is based on its consequences. It was in this vein that Mill made an important modification to Bentham's hedonic calculus. For Bentham, all pleasures are equal in value and only differ insofar as to the extent they produce joy in individuals. By contrast, Mill argued that there is a qualitative difference between the higher pleasures, which are mental, moral, and aesthetic, and lower sensual pleasures. It was for this reason that he famously stated that, quote, "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. And if the fool, or the pig, are of a different opinion, it is because they only know their own side of the question." End quote. Mill contended that we can discern the higher pleasures when the collective of those who have experienced both kinds of enjoyment, sensual and intellectual, we can see what they prefer. Which one they prefer is the higher pleasure. Nevertheless, in a political sphere, the individual is free to pursue those pleasures they desire, providing they do not cause others pain. This is Mill's famous harm principle, in which he stated that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community is not their own good, but it is to prevent harm to others. The avoidance of pain, thus, underpins Mill's conception of a free society, in which government has the right to restrict the actions of the citizenry, if they are likely to produce pain or lower the total amount of happiness in the world. Perhaps the final and most radical change within the liberal tradition was undertaken by 20th century philosopher A.J. Ayer. He argued that ethical statements do not express propositions about morality, but rather are manifestations of emotional attitudes. For example, take the sentence, "It is wrong to kill." In Ayer's view, we cannot empirically verify this claim. Thus, it has not got factual meaning. This is an extreme form of empiricism. Instead, it expresses the opinion of the speaker, which is that they do not like killing and want others not to kill. Thus, there is no such thing as good or evil, or even the supreme good. Rather, there is only what gives me pleasure and what gives me pain, what I like and don't like. All ethics is reduced to expressing these things. Ayer's emotivism provided a bedrock for ethical subjectivism, a theory which claims that moral values are right and wrong according to my moral judgments. For me, that is. It would be the same for you and for each individual, which Ayer would simply reframe as, moral values don't exist, there is just what I like and what you like, and what I like is right for me, and what you like is right for you. This overview of intellectual changes in the conception of the supreme good, by no means exhaustive, should not be taken as saying that the motivations of individuals changed according to these philosophical theories. In fact, a remarkably consistent narrative emerges from Augustine to Mill, that people are primarily motivated by the pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain. What did change, however, was the status of pleasure. In the medieval worldview, virtue or communion with God was the supreme good, which resulted in joy. Happiness became the highest goal and remained the most important values for liberals like Locke, Kant, Bentham, Mill, and Ayer. While some, like Mill, attempted to distinguish higher and lower pleasures, this is problematic when happiness has been made the highest goal. Pleasures can be distinguished in quantitative terms, as Bentham suggested. Indeed, this idea was implicit in Pascal's argument that one should become Christian because the potential reward was the most powerful pleasure experienced for the longest duration. However, qualitative differentiation of pleasures often collapses into quantitative reasoning. When Mill argued that we can discern higher pleasures according to the preferences of those who have experienced higher and lower pleasures, we may want to ask them why they have inclinations towards some pleasures and not others. Invariably, they will say it is more enjoyable or produces more happiness, a quantitative explanation. In which case, all pleasures are morally equal or equal in value in themselves, and they are only distinguished according to the amount of pleasure they produce and pain they avoid. In turn, this means that there is no standard by which to say that some pleasures are fundamentally good and some are fundamentally evil. Without appeal to virtue or deontological ethics, there can only be debates about whether some action produces more or less pleasure. However, as long as you do not harm somebody else, if an action evokes in you or a group of people immense pleasure, no one can object to your doing it. This ethical subjectivism, encapsulated by Ayer's emotivism and Mill's harm principle, seems to be integral to modern Western societies. Or, at least, the individuals and institutions which shape the values by which Western society is governed and constructed and ordered no longer promote virtue or communion with God as the supreme good of human nature, but rather an ethical hedonism and emotivism developed within liberal traditions, thereby validating all pleasure-seeking activities, providing they do not cause others pain. And indeed, these principles can be militarized to free peoples and groups from oppression, insofar as some attitudes or policies prevent their pursuit of happiness. At the same time, the principles of ethical hedonism and emotivism can be used to restrain others from causing physical or emotional pain, such as through hate speech laws. Thus, the change in intellectual culture towards identifying the supreme good as happiness, at least as it turned out in the liberal tradition, may have made permissible and even encouraged much of what is happening in 21st century Western societies.